Hi and welcome to the first and the most simple performance domain, discussing the activities and functions associated with dealing with the project stakeholders. So the stakeholder performance domain addresses activities and functions associated with stakeholders. Effective execution of this performance domain results in the following desired outcomes. So if we executed the activities and functions associated with this performance domain in a proper manner, we should expect these outcomes: a productive working relationship with stakeholders throughout the project, stakeholder agreement with the project objectives and the project outcomes, stakeholders who are project beneficiaries are supportive and satisfied, while stakeholders who may oppose the project or its deliverables do not negatively impact the project outcomes. These are the three key outcomes or the desired outcomes of executing the activities related to this performance domain. So what is a stakeholder? What's the definition of a project stakeholder? A stakeholder is an individual or a group or an organization that may be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity or outcome of a project, program or a portfolio. Any individual or group or organization that might affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by any decision or activity related to our project or program or a portfolio. Stakeholder analysis is a method or a technique of systematically gathering and analyzing quantitative and qualitative information to determine whose interests should be taken into account throughout the project. So as part of this performance domain, we will identify the project stakeholders and we will conduct the stakeholder analysis in order to determine whose interests should be taken into account. Now, stakeholders include individuals, groups, and organizations. So an example of who are the project stakeholders, starting with the project manager, the project management team members, and the project team. All these are internal stakeholders to the project. Then within the organization, we have the governing bodies like the Center of Excellence or the Project Management Office or any steering committees of the organization executives. And out of the organization, we have external stakeholders as well, who could be the suppliers, the customers, end users, regulatory bodies. All these are examples of project stakeholders which you need to identify and analyze and consider throughout the project. A project can have a small group of stakeholders or potentially millions of stakeholders. There may be different stakeholders in different phases of the project, and the influence, power, or interests of stakeholders may change as the project unfolds. So depending on the complexity and the size of the project, we will determine the number of stakeholders. It might be a small group or it might be a very large number, and in cases where there is a very large number of stakeholders, we need to analyze those stakeholders and determine the ones with the highest priority based on their influence and power. Stakeholders could be internal or external to the project. The engagement level of these stakeholders might be supportive, not supportive, or even neutral. Skills required for effective stakeholder engagement and management throughout the project are relevant technical project management skills, interpersonal and leadership skills. These are the skills required for effective stakeholder engagement. Now, what are the steps for proper stakeholder management and engagement throughout the project? Stakeholder engagement includes implementing strategies and actions to promote productive involvement of stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement activities start before or when the project starts and continue throughout the project. So it's a continuous effort. You cannot manage stakeholders only at the initial phase of the project. This is an activity that will be executed throughout the project. Establishing a clear vision that key stakeholders agree on can entail some challenging negotiations, especially with stakeholders who are not necessarily in favor of the project or its intended outcomes. As shown in this figure, there are several steps to engage stakeholders. We will start usually at the very early phases of the project with the identification. We will understand the identified stakeholders. We will conduct the stakeholder analysis in order to prioritize the stakeholders engage them throughout the project, and monitor their engagement. Starting with the identification, high-level stakeholder identification may be carried out prior to forming the project team. This is why I mentioned earlier that this activity is done at the very early phases of the project. Detailed stakeholder identification progressively elaborates the initial work and is a continuous activity throughout the project. So whenever you identify a stakeholders, even if you are at the closure phase of the project, this stakeholder should be identified, analyzed, and added to the stakeholder register. Some stakeholders are easy to identify, such as the customer or the sponsor or the project team and the end users and so forth, but other stakeholders can be difficult to identify when they are not directly connected to the project. Now, how to identify and analyze stakeholders, we will discuss some of the tools and techniques and the methods and models section. But stakeholders identification is the first step in managing the stakeholder engagement, and there is a various pool of tools and techniques that can be used to support this step. Then we will understand and analyze the stakeholders. Understand stakeholders' feelings, emotions, beliefs, and values. We want to understand our stakeholders. These elements can lead to additional threats or opportunities for the project outcomes. Then analyzing stakeholders, considering several stakeholder aspects. Some of the aspects we will analyze the stakeholders based on includes the power, impact, attitude, beliefs, expectations, degree of influence, proximity to the project, interest in the project, and other aspects surrounding stakeholder interaction with the project. Stakeholder aspects help the project team consider interactions that may influence the motivations, actions, and behaviors of stakeholders. The project team should consider how stakeholders interact with each other, as they often form alliances that help or hinder the project objectives. So we need to understand the characteristics of the project key stakeholders and if there is any key interaction between the different stakeholders. After understanding and analyzing these stakeholders, the identified stakeholders in the project, we will be able to prioritize them based on their importance. The project team can complete an initial prioritization of stakeholders based on the analysis. Focus on stakeholders with the most power and interest as one way to prioritize the engagement. As events unfold throughout the project team may need to reprioritize based on new stakeholders or evolving changes in the stakeholder landscape. So the outcome of this step is having a list of prioritized stakeholders based on the ones with the highest power and interest on the project. Then we will engage the stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement entails working collaboratively with stakeholders to introduce the project, elicit their requirements, manage expectations, resolve issues, negotiate, prioritize, problem solve, and make decisions. Engaging stakeholders requires the application of soft skills of the project manager and the project management team members, such as active listening, interpersonal skills, and conflict management, as well as leadership skills such as establishing the vision and critical thinking. These are the soft skills the project manager and the project management team should have in order to effectively engage stakeholders throughout the project. Communication with stakeholders can take place via written or verbal means, and it can be formal or informal. Examples of each type of communication: it can be a verbal, formal communication like the presentations, the project reviews, the briefings, product demos, and brainstormings. It can be verbal, informal like the conversations and ad hoc discussions. It can be written, formal like the progress reports, project documents, and business case, or it can be written, informal like the brief notes, emails, instant messaging or texting, and social media. All these are types of communications you can use to deal with the project stakeholders. In addition to the types of communications, we have the communication methods which we can use to engage with stakeholders, starting with the push communication method. This is a very important topic and you should expect at least one question in the exam about it. Communication sent to stakeholders such as memos, emails, status reports, voicemail, and so forth. All these are examples of push communication method used for one-way communications with individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders. It inhibits the ability to immediately gauge reaction and assess understanding. Therefore, it should be used deliberately. So this is the push communication. It's a one-way communication method. It can be with individual stakeholders or with groups of stakeholders. The second method is the pull communication. Pull information sought by the stakeholders, such as a project team member going to an internet to find communication policies or templates, running internet research, and using online repositories. These are examples of the pull communication method. It is used for indirect sensing of stakeholder concerns. The third method is the interactive communication. It includes an exchange of information with one or more stakeholders, such as conversations, phone calls, meetings, brainstorming, product demos, and the like. Quick feedback loops provide useful information to confirm the degree to which the stakeholders heard the message. These are the benefits of having a feedback loop. When you communicate something with another stakeholder, confirm the degree to which the stakeholder heard the message, determine if the stakeholders agree with the message, identify non-sent or other unintended messages and the recipient detected, and gain other helpful insights. This is the best method or type of communication, having an interactive communication. Engagement goes deeper than pushing or pulling communication. The engagement means having an interactive communication with the stakeholders. The last step in stakeholder engagement is to monitor. Reasons why stakeholder engagement need to be monitored throughout the project: because the stakeholders could change, the attitude or power of some stakeholders may change, effectiveness of the engagement strategy could change, thus it requires reassessment, and the methods to determine the degree of stakeholder satisfaction includes having a direct conversation with stakeholders or project and iteration reviews in agile development approach, product reviews, stage gates throughout the project, or a survey if there is a large groups of stakeholders. Using any of these methods, you will be able to determine the degree of satisfaction for the project stakeholders. Where necessary, the stakeholder engagement approach can be updated to achieve higher stakeholder satisfaction. So even the approach will be determined as part of the planning, but it can be updated later on to make sure we are achieving a high degree of stakeholders satisfaction. Now, what are the interactions of the stakeholder performance domain with other performance domains? Here is a sample list of items the stakeholder performance domain integrates and interweaves with other performance domains through they are not inclusive. So some examples: stakeholders permeate all aspects of the project, so there will be an interaction with all other performance domains. They define and prioritize the requirements and scope for the project team, so it will interact with the project work performance domain, as the project work will focus on the scope and quality, and the stakeholders will define and prioritize the requirements of the scope. They participate in and shape the planning efforts of the project, so there will be an interaction with the planning performance domain. They determine acceptance and quality criteria for project deliverables and outcomes, so it will interact with project delivery. They use the project deliverables and influence the realization of project outcomes, lowering or increasing the amount of uncertainty, as the stakeholders and the characteristics of the stakeholders will either lower or increase the amount of uncertainty we have in the project. So there will be an interaction with the uncertainty performance domain. Some stakeholders focus on measures of performance for the project and its deliverables, so stakeholders as well will interact with the performance domain of conducting the measurement activities. All these are examples of interactions between the stakeholder performance domain and other performance domains. Now, how to check the results? We have 3 desired outcomes. The first one is a productive working relationship with stakeholders throughout the project, and this can be checked with A productive working relationship can be simply observed in the project. However, the movement of stakeholders along a continuum of engagement can indicate the relative level of satisfaction within the project. So we need to keep an eye on the relationships with the project stakeholders. The second outcome is stakeholder agreement with project objectives. A significant number of changes or modifications to the project and product requirements in addition to the scope may indicate stakeholders are not engaged or aligned with the project objectives. So we can simply check this outcome with the number of changes that occur to the project and the requirements. The third outcome was that stakeholders who are project beneficiaries are supportive and satisfied, and you need to deal with stakeholders who oppose the project or its deliverables, that they do not negatively impact the project results. Stakeholder behavior can indicate whether project beneficiaries are satisfied and supportive of the project or whether they oppose it. Surveys, interviews, and focus groups are also effective ways to determine if stakeholders are satisfied and supportive or if they oppose the project and its deliverables. A review of the project issue register and risk register can identify challenges associated with individual stakeholders. So these are the methods where you can check the desired outcomes of the successful completion of the stakeholder engagement activities and functions.